So in my presentation today, I want to speak about a couple of political developments in Indonesia in the past year, and I want to do that particularly by looking at some human rights developments, particularly pertaining to Papua, freedom of expression and gender equality. And at the end, I want to reflect on the state of democratic quality in Indonesia. But first, I would like to start by talking a little bit about the broader political context, and that is one of democratic decline. Indonesia is often hailed as Southeast Asia's largest democracy, and indeed it has proven to be remarkably resilient since 1998. But Indonesia's democratic regime is also laden with democratic deficits, and over the past few years, these deficits have become more plentiful and more severe. And this has prompted observers of Indonesia to speak of democratic regression. Indicators of Indonesia's democratic decline include the spread of nationalist and religious populism, discrimination against religious and sexual minorities, entrenched corruption, as well as the government's increased willingness to silence its critics, including the weakening of formal democratic institutions. Examples of this are the weakening of the Corruption Eradication Commission, or KPK, and similarly the passing of the 2020 Omnibus Law on Job Creation, which has been widely criticised as it restricts the rights of workers and indigenous groups and dismantles many environmental protections. The deficits of Indonesia's democracy came into sharp view in the last 2 years as Indonesia struggled through the COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly last year when the Delta variant ripped through the country and Indonesia became the epicenter of the pandemic in Asia. As I think most people here would know, in early August 2021, Indonesia passed a grim milestone of passing more than 100,000 confirmed COVID-19 deaths, and that number is now over 156,000. That did not only lay bare the flaws in Indonesia's public health system, but it also said something about how rising populism, increased religious conservatism, political polarization and corruption prevented a more effective response to one of the largest global health crises of our time, with a huge human toll. With politicians at the highest levels actively aiding the erosion of Indonesia's democratic regime foundations, including President Jokowi, it's really not so surprising that observers of Indonesia have even said that we are witnessing an authoritarian turn. What is perhaps most surprising in that context, though, is that Jokowi has continued to enjoy relatively high approval ratings, including at the peak of the pandemic. A recent survey by Indikator Politik suggests that while his approval rating is currently declining, this is largely in response to increased prices, rather than, for instance, mismanagement of the pandemic or ongoing issues of corruption. In turn, that has driven, Jokowi's high approval ratings have driven discussions to keep the president in power for a third term, extending his tenure beyond the 2-term limit mandated in the Indonesian constitution. Although just a few weeks ago, Jokowi ordered his ministers to stop advocating for extending his time in office, the discussions surrounding the extension are very concerning, considering that that 2-term limit on presidential terms was actually a core reform of the post-authoritarian period. As such, those debates are actually a reminder of the New Order regime, where there was no such limit, and it also really illustrates the willingness of elites to undo some of the hard-won reforms of the post-1998 period, and critics have also argued that this might actually open up the door for further constitutional changes and indeed reversing some of those gains. I now want to turn to a number of the human rights issues that I want to look at. By no means, complete, but just a few things that I want to highlight. And the first one is that that an indicator of deepening illiberalism in Indonesia, and arguably its authoritarian turn, has been increased militarization and securitization. And the impact of that is most strongly felt in Papua and West Papua, where the human rights situation has indeed been a major cause of concern for decades, due to the government's heavy-handed approach to dealing with Papua's independence struggle, which in turn, of course, dates back to the 1960s. Jokowi, as his predecessor Yudhoyono, has taken a prosperity and development-based approach to Papua, particularly focusing on enhancing infrastructure and connectivity. That prosperity and development-based approach is combined with a security approach, which includes counterinsurgency operations, internet shutdowns, and the repression of dissent and protests. These approaches, however, have not led to much success. Papua remains very poorly developed, as we can see, for instance, from the very high infant and maternal mortality rates, and the Jokowi government has not been able to end violence in the region. We actually saw increased reports of clashes in 2021. Yet, the Indonesian government is not planning on changing its approach to the region. In July last year, the Indonesian Special Autonomy legislation for Papua and West Papua, or OTSUS, was revised and extended for 20 years. This revised law allows for additional funds for the development of the provinces, so reflecting that prosperity and development-based approach, but also prohibits the formation of local political parties. While the Indonesian government claims that the revisions will ensure more opportunities for indigenous Papuans, enhance funding for healthcare and education, and ensure that more proceeds from natural resources will remain in the region, critics have slammed the government for a lack of consultation with local communities, particularly those local communities that are more critical of Jakarta, and have also warned that these revisions might allow for the further division of Papua in more administrative areas. And indeed, just last month, the Indonesian parliament approved 3 bills to create, if they are passed, 3 additional provinces in Papua, in addition to the existing 2, so going from 2 to 5. Now, this is not just a matter of just retracing boundaries, but if these bills are passed and these new provinces are created, it actually allows for more government presence, it allows for increased military and security posts, and we all know that this will contribute, or very likely to contribute, to more violent conflict. And that the Indonesian government is also not changing its security approach to the region. That's evident in that, but we've also actually already seen it intensify in the past year. So in mid-2021, in 2021, Jakarta designated armed groups in Papua as terrorist organizations. Now, this was mainly directed at the OPM, or the Free Papua movement, but it actually also allows the government to broaden its security approach to the region even more. That includes not only sending more troops for military operations, but also as personnel in what are called territorial development operations. So think of the construction of roads and schools and hospitals and so on. So it allows for a much higher military presence. The commander of the armed forces, General Andika Perkasa, has also announced plans to establish a further 8 military district commands, and that will increase military presence in what is already the most heavily militarized area in Indonesia. And it is likely to lead to more human rights violations and further embed an existing culture of impunity. And what perhaps also should be mentioned is that the local population is very distrustful of the Indonesian government and the military because of this long history. And that also, for instance, means if we're looking at vaccine rollouts, is that many people are reluctant to get vaccines because they're afraid that it's not actually going to protect them, but it will harm them. So those things all also play into other areas. Okay, now if we move from Papua to the area of freedom of expression, and of course, as you might already know and can imagine, Papua is also not a very safe place to be for journalists, for instance. But freedom of expression under the Jokowi presidency in general has come under increasing pressure, and one area where we have seen this is through the increased use of the so-called Electronic Information and Transactions Law, or the ITE law. And that law is increasingly used against activists, lawyers, journalists, as well as ordinary citizens that comment on social media, as well as academics. So I'll just give 2 examples of that. So for instance, when we come to the example of this law being used against human rights activists, here at the top of the slide, you see a photo of human rights activists Haris Azhar and Fatia Maulidiyanti. who in March of this year were charged with defamation under the ITE law after being reported last year by Luhut bin Sarpanjaitan, the Coordinating Minister for Maritime and Investment Affairs. Now, Luhut's complaint was in response to Haris and Faisal discussing an NGO report that stated on Papua, that stated security presence had escalated armed conflict in Papua. The report also mentioned that several mining companies in Papua benefit from this security presence, and one of these companies is one that Luhut is affiliated with. So in response to that, he reported them. This case is an example of how the ITE law is used against activists, and also how members of the political economic elites are using this law to silence critics or to threaten those who are supposedly harming their reputation. If we look at an example of how the ITE law is used against academics, one example is that of Saiful Mahdi, a lecturer from Aceh, who in September last year was sentenced to 3 months imprisonment and a fine of 10 million rupiah after he had criticized his university's recruitment process in a private and thus closed WhatsApp group. He did receive a presidential amnesty, but it's also another example, and he's one of several examples. Another development in the context of academic freedom was the establishment of the National Research and Innovation Agency, BRIN, which was actually established, or the idea behind it was to improve efficiency, coordination between research centres across government agencies and ministries, and also really push research-backed, the development of research-based policies. But BRIN is positioned directly under the President, and the chief of the PDIP, or the Indonesian Democratic Party of Struggle, Megawati Soekarno Putri, was appointed to lead the BRIN Supervisory Board. And Megawati has been very outspoken in that all research must be aligned with Indonesia's state ideology, Pancasila. And this really is an illustration of the increased use of of Pancasila to demand obedience to the government, or at least be less critical, and obviously it can interfere with academic freedom. Then, another example is that also artists have not been immune from further crackdowns on freedom of expression. So that's the image here down the bottom. Last year, local authorities painted over murals that criticized the government's management of the COVID pandemic. One of these murals, so pictured here, was an image of Jokowi, his eyes covered with the internet error message 404 not found. The artists involved with these murals were called in for questioning by the police, and some of them were forced to offer a public apology. Now, authorities have argued that the murals insult the president, being a state symbol. That can be debated. They also justified the removal of murals in the context of public order, thereby really challenging the human right of freedom of expression and artistic expression. Presidential Chief of Staff Muldoko added that by calling the artists in, the government was not being repressive, instead it was educating the artists. So we see that the government actually has, at the highest levels, a direct hand in limiting creative, artistic expression, and stifling opposition, and weakening very critical civil society voices. I now want to move to developments regarding gender equality. And I think, thank you. In the context of the COVID pandemic, we have seen a pushback on earlier made advancements in gender equality, with women being much harder hit by the pandemic in general than men. That is, of course, not a uniquely Indonesian situation. Across the globe, we have seen that women have been disproportionately affected by job losses, by taking on more unpaid care work, and that women, rather than men, were also more likely to be excluded from decision-making spaces, pushing them back into more domestic roles. And in the Indonesian context, that's really a reflection of the salience of gender ideologies that emphasize traditional roles of women confined to the households. Perhaps most concerning has been that, and again, like many other countries in the world, is that Indonesia has experienced an increase in gender-based violence during the pandemic. In March this year, the National Commission on Violence Against Women, Komnas Perempuan, reported that in 2021 it received just under 4,000 reports of gender-based violence, and that was an 80% increase from the previous year. Moreover, because that's just what Komnas Perempuan receives, when that number then is combined with the complaints received by other institutions, including NGOs and the religious courts, in Indonesia, Indonesia recorded in 2021 a total of 338,496 cases of gender-based violence. And we all know that gender-based violence is unreported, so we can expect that number to be higher. But it's not all doom and gloom. Just last month, and after a very tireless and long campaign by gender activists that lasted for well over a decade, Indonesia's national parliament finally passed a law on sexual violence. There had been fierce opposition to this law, with the conservative Islamist political party PKS, or Prosperous Justice Party, alleging that because the bill did not criminalise sex outside marriage, it would promote sexual promiscuity and so-called deviant sexual behaviour, and that resulted in significant delays. In the end, it was passed with support by all political party factions except from the PKS. The law is significant as it recognises 9 types of sexual violence not covered in existing laws, including online sexual violence. The law has a very strong focus on victims and also includes provisions on gender training for police, prosecutors and judges, which really should enhance the gender sensitivity in criminal justice processes. So it's a really important step forward. The struggle, however, is far from over. The next challenge is always that of implementation, and there's also other changes or ongoing deliberations regarding a revised criminal code in Indonesia that do have the potential to restrict the rights of women, as well as gender and sexual minorities. So it's definitely not, the fight is definitely not over. So taken together, what can we take from these developments? What does it mean for where Indonesian politics are going, where human rights are going, and indeed the quality of democracy? The developments that are discussed in the context of Papua, freedom of expression and gender equality are cause for serious concern. They are a reflection of the broader context of democratic decline that has come to characterize Indonesian politics in the last 5 to 6 years. Interestingly, however, recent assessments of Indonesia in democracy indexes actually suggest that democratic decline has come to a halt. So, for instance, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit Democracy Index, Indonesia is still a flawed democracy, but it recorded an improvement in Indonesia's overall score for 2021, ranking it on the 52nd place, which is up 12 places from 2020, where it was 64th. Similarly, in its Freedom of the World report, Freedom House reported the same score for Indonesia this year as in 2021, 59 out of 100, designating it partly free. So what does that mean? It suggests that, at least according to these indexes, that democratic regression has not become worse over the last 12 months. However, the current stagnation is also at a lower level of democratic equality than Indonesia has seen before, and in which we are seeing serious limitations to human rights protections and civil liberties. At the same time, there are glimmers of hope, such as that law on sexual violence that I just mentioned. Another one is that in November last year, the Indonesian Constitutional Court ruled that the controversial omnibus law needs to be revised. And it is important too to recognise that Indonesians are very critical of political developments that are threatening to undo significant democratic reforms. And hopefully, as the images in this presentation have also conveyed, Indonesians are fighting back, they're pushing for legislative change, they're doing protests, they're continuing with artistic expression and activism. And I think that is also really important to consider. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, we're open for our last round of questions. Who'd like to start us off? Michael.
Great paper, Ken, thank you. I've got a question about Papua. My understanding was that the Constitutional Court of Indonesia had at one point rejected the second province that they were proposing to create, or perhaps it was the third, I suppose, once you've created one extra. About 10 years ago, there was a constitutional decision that stopped the proposal to have 3 provinces in Papua. What's changed with that? Now you're talking about a new proposal for 5 provinces there.
Well, the proposal is for 3 new ones, so in total 5. So yeah, what's changed there? It's actually a really good question, Michael. I'm not exactly sure. I do think that there has been an increased focus under the Jokowi presidency on really, well, the idea is to resolve conflict in Papua, but the approach is very much still through this prosperity and welfare-based approach, which I think Indonesian legislators are trying to do by this, well, extending the regional, the special autonomy law. The thing is, though, is that these things only address the symptoms of the conflict and actually not the actual roots. And that is, and I think that is a real problem, as well as the continuing lack of broad consultation with local communities. And that creates a divide. And I think that actually means that whatever is being decided actually isn't fully responsive to the needs on the ground.
Yeah, just waiting a bit. I didn't see any other questions. You hinted at PKS a little bit, and their use of Islam as in their arguments, in their political arguments. I've lived in Indonesia for almost 18 years, recently moved to Australia, and I've seen an increase in sort of Islam being used within politics. More and more of an Islamic sauce is being put on legislation, on regulation. Parties are really smart to play out big civil society groups. You haven't mentioned, well, of course that was before 2021, but the big, the marches in Jakarta, the Memutihkan Jakarta, was a big success. And Ahok, of course, was the biggest case there. What is your sort of take, given your expertise on this? How is that going to go forward? Are we going to see an increase of that sort of majoritarism? Because people who speak on behalf of Islam, they feel so supported and so confident because they feel, the nation is behind me, and it's doing so much bad for minority groups, and so little has been done to recognize indigenous beliefs and other minority beliefs, even though you can have it on your cap and pay these days, but more than that hasn't really been done for these groups, and even they fall under budaya in terms of the government structure, indigenous beliefs, who are often older than some of the, as you know all this, but can you please expound a little bit on your take on these developments of more and more Islam coming into politics, and how do you think that is going to play out? Is that going to continue, or have we seen the worst?
It's a really interesting question. With regard to this, more Islam in politics, I think it's not just politics, it's also society. Part of that has to do, as we know, with the suppression of political Islam under the new order and actually the post-authoritarian period actually allowing for more political Islam to actually be more prominent, including also in social life. I didn't really mention it in my presentation. It's really hard to kind of condense everything in very limited time. But I think, I think we have seen in the past couple of years increased religious conservatism, and how that has really impacted on, for instance, even, let's say, the pandemic response, right? With the government not wanting to call a ban on mudik, wanting leaving that to the Islamic mass organizations, who in turn didn't really want to say about it anyway. So that that is, I think, a really good example of how that then plays out. I think we've also seen, of course, the repression after those mass demonstrations, the repression of more conservative Islamic organizations and groups, and at the same time we have seen an accommodation of more mainstream religious Islamic mass organizations to actually balance that, and for, including the president, to have those Islamic credentials. So you're absolutely right that it's a huge part of where Indonesian politics is going, and it's a major influence. And yes, we've seen that, for instance, in pushing back on that law on sexual violence. And I think it's very likely that we will see that again we see that in ongoing deliberations around the criminal code. And you can imagine that those factions will push for more conservative interpretations, or they will push for those conservative amendments to the criminal code, which also includes, as you just mentioned, religious minorities. I think a prohibition on if you would leave one of Indonesia's recognized religions, that's actually going to be criminalized. So those things are hugely concerning, and they will very much, if they're passed, they will very much impact on minorities, whether we're talking about gender or religious or sexual minorities. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah.
I just ask two questions if I may. The first one, just following up there. Did you just say that this new law is passed if you leave one of the recognised religions that will be criminalised? Do I hear that correctly?
That's a proposal. It's not in.
It's not just apostasy in Islam. If you leave another.
Recognized, yes. So one of the 6 government religions that are.
If you were a nominal Christian, you decide to leave, you would be now criminalised.
If someone reports you, yes, that could be.
Okay. The second, my real question was, getting back to the Papua issue, who's actually driving the proposed legislation for 3 new provinces? Is it from groups seeking money in Papua, or is it from a central government driving? Who's actually driving?
Look, I must admit, I'll actually have to do a little bit more research into that. But these bills were supported widely by Parliament, so it has broad elite support. And I think definitely there is a role also to play by the military, that of course has a vested interest in Papua. We also see this with the companies, the mining companies that are influential and active in Papua, and of course, how they have their relationships with members of the political elites. So I think there are very strong oligarchic interests there. But I'll really have to disentangle that further.
Okay, I know you've got a question, Tamara, but we're actually going to call it quits because it's 1:45. And first, before I wrap up, please join me in thanking